I think the first thing we want to do, though, is talk about what hip-hop is all about from the beginning, from when I was a kid. I grew up hip-hop in the South Bronx, New York City. A lot of people don't really know the real roots of where hip-hop began, and it's from the Bronx. The Bronx is a borough in New York. New York City has 5 boroughs. If we could close that door. There's 5 cities in New York: Queens, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and the South Bronx. And the South Bronx was probably the worst ghetto in America during that time, in the 70s, when hip-hop began. And that's pretty much where the root came from. A lot of oppression and being in poverty. And during the late 60s, they were burning the buildings down in the Bronx and collecting the insurance money. So if you look at the Bronx in the 70s, you'll see why the Bronx was so bad. It was like what Afghanistan looks like in Iraq after they bombed it. Every building in the Bronx was torn down. It looked like it was blown up. And the streets were filled with garbage, gutter, glass. The people in the Bronx were so poor, you know, we couldn't keep the lights on, we couldn't buy food, you know, a lot of things like that. It was mostly black and Latino people in the Bronx at the time, but you had other races too. You had anybody who was poor ended up in the Bronx. If your building got burnt down in Manhattan, they send you to the Bronx. It's like they're sending you to hell. I originally was born in Spanish Harlem in 1965. Don't do the math. And then we got kicked out of the house in Spanish Harlem, and then we ended up in the Bronx when I was 5 years old. Yeah, we can just cut the music off, totally. And then at that point was when I realized when we were driving into the Bronx, it looked like we were going into hell. Most of the buildings in the Bronx were so bad that they would brick the window and paint flower pots and curtains on the brick. They wouldn't fix the building for the people to live in. Anything facing the highway, they would sandblast the building facing the highway, brick the windows, and paint flower pots and curtains so anybody that drove by the Bronx would think, oh, the Bronx looks nice. But on the other side, the building was rubble. And that's where we played. That's where we hung out. That's where the drug dealers did their thing. That's where dead bodies were found. That's where rats were, where dogs were. It was just a real scary place. But that was our childhood. But during that time, I'm just trying to paint you a picture of what it was like. You would see dudes running into stores, a bodega, and then you hear gunshots go off, and then they see the dude and bodies all over the place and people running out. I mean, this was on a regular basis. You could talk to a guy 1 minute, and then you turn your back, walk up the block, and then you hear the gunshots, and then you walk back, and that same guy you was talking about is dead on the floor. That was the reality of the Bronx. That's how bad it was. It was like the Wild Wild West. The police wouldn't go into the Bronx. They would only go in after people were killed. They wouldn't go in to protect the people. You know? Less paperwork if the people are dead. It was a horrible place. But the beauty of it all was we found ways to get our mind off of that. During the time in the early 70s, a lot of DJs would bring equipment out into the streets and play music for the people for free. And this was normal in New York City, not just the Bronx. Brooklyn, Manhattan, Queens, wherever there was a hood, you might hear about a jam, because we didn't call it hip-hop yet. And a jam could be a disco jam, a soul jam. Maybe the Trinidadians might want to play music from Trinidad. It was just common for a DJ to play music. That culture came from Jamaica and the islands, where they would bring out big speakers and turntables and play music. And people would dance. That was normal in Jamaica and Trinidad and these type of islands, the Caribbeans. A lot of that culture came by way of Jamaica, Trinidad. They call it a carnival or something like that. But in New York, our music was soul music, Latin soul music, that it derived from a sound called a boogaloo. Not the popping boogaloo, it was the Latino boogaloo. Boogaloo music really was when they mixed black and Latino music together. So you got the Latin percussion sounds mixed with R&B and doo-wop, and the dancers would mix mambo with Lindy Hop, and they would end up with these dances that look like top rock, but eventually became what we know as hip-hop. But this was our parents' generation, the Boogaloo generation. One of the first movements to come out of the Boogaloo generation was what we call the disco. People think it was a music. Actually, a disco was a club. They called it a discotheque. The French came to New York. They built the first discotheque. The Italian mafia kicked their ass and threw them out, and they took it over. And the Italian mafia brought in Latino DJs and black DJs to play the music in the discotheque. And the music of that time for disco was the James Brown sound. Most people would think disco was... No, but the original disco music was the James Brown sound, like breakbeats. And this became really popular with the older generation. And the DJs became famous. And a lot of these DJs would also play in the streets. But they would play mostly upscale sound that you would hear in the club. I think that also they didn't like the Bronx B-boy attitude, the Bronx boys, because the Bronx people were pretty gangster, pretty rough, dressed ghetto, act ghetto, you know. So a lot of times when you get a Bronx cat going to a club in Manhattan, they didn't like him going in there. So there was a lot of little back and forth between the street cats and the DJ crowd that went to the big clubs playing music. I think that Kool Herc wanted to kind of counteract that, kind of like a middle finger to the disco people. He did it in the streets, the same way the disco DJ did it. He played music in the streets though, using the same style, but he focused mostly on the James Brown sound and the break. When he realized when he cut the breaks, the B-boys would go off. Go off was the original get buck. We didn't say get buck, we said you go off, go crazy. They would go off on the floor. When he saw that the Bronx kids was going off to these breaks, instead of playing the same old breaks that all the disco DJs played, he started going into the record stores and buying obscure records that nobody really knew about and discovering his own breaks. And that began the movement of what we call hip-hop. The DJ digging for breaks that nobody had, discovering new break beats. Forget the music part, forget all the bass lines and the guitars. We could look on a record and find a break just by looking at the lines of the record. That's how good the DJs got finding break beats. They started finding all these crazy breaks, play them at a jam, and that's how the DJs got famous. By the breaks that he played. They would cover the label. Today everybody shares music, and it's common, but really in hip-hop you're not supposed to share your music. Your music is what brings the people to your club or to your jam. The DJs never shared the music. They would take the label, soak it in water, rip the label off, and you would try to peek and see what the break was, and you couldn't. There was no name on it. So that every DJ was known for their style of break beats that they found at the record store. That's how they created a following. Kool Herc threw the first jam in '73 with this style of music, and that was the beginning of the culture. All the B-boys and B-girls would show up, and they would go off. The original hip-hop dance is breaking. Breaking is first hip-hop dance. When you talk to an OG and you ask what is hip-hop dance, they're gonna say breaking. But back then, the breakers were also party dancers. Party rockers, meaning they could dance to a break, go off on the floor, or they could freestyle on the floor with grooves and party dance like Buddha Stretch. All the B-boys from my generation could party dance. And today that's not as common with the B-boy community, B-girl community.